Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, or ISAS, I warmly welcome you to this afternoon's book launch for India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, come panel discussion. To start off, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Tan Tai Yong, Director of ISAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Tan, please.
Chairman Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, distinguished panelists, colleagues and friends. First of all, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's book launch and panel discussion. I am especially delighted to welcome Professor Niraja Gopal, Professor and Chairperson, Center for the Study of Law and Governance at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm very glad that she's able to travel to Singapore to join us for this afternoon's launch. Now, those of you who've been following ISAS activities over the past few years will realize that we've been launching a number of books recently, most of them written, in fact all of them written by ISAS faculty. These books have contributed to enriching the wider literature, academic literature and policy literature on South Asia, and today's book launch is another notable addition to these efforts by ISAS. Now, the book being launched today, India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, is co-authored by Professor John Harris, visiting research professor at ISAS. Now, for those of us who work on South Asia, I think you all know of the reputation of Professor John Harris. He has done outstanding work on politics and the political economy of South Asia and India for several years, and his expertise range over agriculture, rural development, poverty, labor markets, civil society, and politics and governance in general. He has been doing extensive field work in India for decades, and I take my hat off to him because he continuously goes to do this very difficult field work in India, and he has not eased off after all these years. So I'm really inspired by his personal example. Now, he has taught and worked at the London School of Economics and the University of East Anglia for several years, and is now a distinguished senior faculty at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He has been a visiting faculty at ISAS for more than 2 years now, and he has recently started a major research project within the Institute on young people in India, social change, development and politics, and this, as you can imagine, will entail a lot of field work in India, and he has already had one meeting with researchers in India, and there will be a series more leading to the conclusion of this very important project. Now, the book that we're going to launch today. Now, this book contextualizes India's high growth and rapid economic transformation over the last couple of decades with the social and political implications of such growth and transformation. Now, India has indeed come a long way from being identified as a large and critical developing economy to one that is poised to become a global economic powerhouse. But this fascinating transformation has been accompanied by disturbing socio-political features, such as widening income gap and regional disparities, poor governance, manifesting in deficient supply of public goods and basic services, insurgent outbreaks, and a fractured polity. So academics and policymakers are now debating on modern India, and what that debate centers on is whether India will be able to maintain economic progress, notwithstanding many of these socio-political vulnerabilities. In their book, Professor Harris and his co-authors, Professor Stuart Corbridge and Professor Craig Jeffrey. Professor Stuart Corbridge is from the London School of Economics, and Professor Jeffrey from Oxford University, study the nuances of India's modern political economy in the context of this core question by reviewing various strands of scholarship that has flourished on India's economic and social transformation over the last couple of decades. In this respect, the book is a valuable addition to the existing scholarship and research on India and South Asia. As an institute focusing on contemporary aspects of South Asia, particularly the region's economy, politics, and strategic affairs, ISAS is keen on tracking the enormous churnings that are now taking place in different countries of the region, particularly India, as they adjust to a globalized world with their own frailties. in this regard, this book by Professor Harris and other scholars, and also those from other faculty members from ISAS and contemporary South Asia, will continue to add to the variety of alternative perspectives on these particular developments. So we hope to maintain this tradition, and we look forward to inviting you to more book launches of other works that are done by our colleagues, and also to generate more discussion on developments in South Asia. So I take this opportunity once again to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event, and I hope that we'll have a fruitful discussion that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tan. May I now invite Professor John Harris, co-writer of India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, to give us an introduction of the book. Professor Harris, please.
Well, first, thank you, Professor Tan Tai Yong, for those very kind remarks. And I mean, this is an occasion when I can actually say thank you to you and to ISAS for the hospitality that you have given me, the space that you have given me over the last 2 and more years. Most of the work that I did for this book was actually done at ISAS, so it really is an ISAS book. I don't usually speak from a text, but I'm a little bit worried about the time. So even though this is a fairly intimate occasion, I feel I'm really sort of speaking rather amongst friends. You'll forgive me if I do use my text. The book is actually a sequel to an earlier book that I wrote with my friend Stuart Corbridge at the London School of Economics. And that book was called Reinventing India, and it was published in 2000. And Reinventing presents an analytical history of what might be thought of as the invention of modern India, and then its gradual reinvention towards the end of the 20th century. What we call the invention of modern independent India came about through the struggles of Indian nationalists against colonial rule and their debates amongst themselves, especially in those more formal debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly that drew up the Constitution of India promulgated in 1950. The outcome was that India was defined in terms of what we consider 4 founding myths. The newly independent country was to be a parliamentary democracy, it was to be broadly socialist, secular in the particular sense of giving equal respect to all religions, and it was to be a federal state. Our book sought to show how and why these founding principles came to be undone, how and why India's democracy, though vibrant in some respects, was undermined by the practices of politicians and by limitations in the realization of the constitutional promise of universal citizenship. How and why the particular project of building a modern nation through what Nehru referred to as a third way of democratic socialism came to be replaced by the pursuit of neoliberal principles in economic policy. How the secular character of the Indian state was challenged by the rise of Hindu nationalism and the electoral success of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and how Indian federalism, that had initially been of a distinctly centralized kind, was being changed through the operations of a federal market economy. As Stuart Corbridge and I saw it, both the shifts in economic policy that took place in the 1990s and the rise of Hindu nationalism could be seen as elite revolts in the context of the increasing plebeian assertiveness most clearly reflected in the emergence of a new generation of political leaders from amongst the OBCs and the Dalits, the likes especially of Mulayam Singh Yadav in UP, Lalu Prasad Yadav in Bihar, and the Dalit leader Mayawati. By about 2000, when Reinventing was published, India was still, of course, formally a democracy, but there was little indication that there was much of what we might call substantial democracy. the broad, substantive, perhaps would be a better word, substantive democracy. The very broad developmental objectives of the Nehruvian state had been replaced by a single-minded commitment to economic growth to be achieved by the dedicated pursuit of economic liberalism. Secularism and inclusive citizenship stood, it seemed, to be overwhelmed by the construction of a Hindu Rashtra that seemed a distinct possibility given the political ascendancy of the BJP, and Indian federalism was under strain from the increasing inequality between states. I just thought it was worthwhile recapping a little what we had said, sorts of things that we had argued in the earlier book, because I want really, in a way, to look back to around 2000, because what India Today, this book, is about, is rather about what has happened over the last decade or so. It is, I should say, I think that I should full tribute to my co-authors, Stuart Corbridge, who's now Deputy Director, actually, of the LSE, and Craig Jeffrey, and I'm very proud of the fact that Craig Jeffrey, now a full professor at Oxford, is actually our former student. It's an attempt on our part to write contemporary history, but the book is organised thematically around a series of questions. When and why did India take off? How have the poor fared? Why hasn't economic growth delivered more for Indian workers? Is the Indian state delivering on promises of inclusive growth and social justice? Has India's democracy been a success? Is the government of India becoming more responsive? Has the rise of Hindu nationalism halted? Why has Maoism become such a force in rural India? Does India have a civil society? Does caste still matter? How much have things changed for Indian women? Can India benefit from its demographic dividend? It's a pretty comprehensive treatment, I think, though there are some obvious gaps, notably in regard to the environment. I think we also wish that we'd been able to dedicate a chapter as well to what is going on in India's big cities. What I thought I'd do now, rather than trying to summarize our answers to that long list of questions that we've raised, I thought I'd rather like to point to what I consider to be fundamental factors that influence the ways in which India is changing economically, socially, and politically. There are three key factors as I see it. Firstly, the class character of the Indian state. Secondly, the failure of the structural transformation of the economy. And thirdly, the persistence and the deepening of inequality, which is still substantially legitimated by hierarchical social values. I can perhaps best explain how I understand the class character of the Indian state by reference to what it is not. It is not a developmental state in which a strong executive is able to provide incentives to private capital, including, if necessary, by getting the prices wrong or governing the market, to use the key phrases of the best studies of East Asian developmental states, that by Alice Amsden of South Korea and of Robert Wade on Taiwan. But the executive of the developmental state doesn't only set up incentives for business. It combines this with a capacity for disciplining private capitals. For example, by the switching off of support for companies that aren't successful in export markets. The Indian state, it seems to me, has never had this capacity, in spite of the rhetoric of some politicians, including Nehru at times, and in spite of legislation such as that directed against monopolies. I mean, just pause for a moment. You know, Jawaharlal Nehru sometimes participated in debates in the Lok Sabha in which there was a lot of, fiery talk about nationalization and so on. But very often he was just a couple of days later talking to Fiki in Calcutta or something and saying something rather different to big business people. The most persuasive model of the class character of the Indian state through to the early 1980s is that of Pranab Bardhan, who argued that the capacities of the state were constrained by the contestations for power between three propertied classes: big business, the dominant landholders, and the professional bureaucratic elite. Development resources, Bardhan argues, were frittered away in subsidy payments and unproductive rents made to these three classes. Now, as Bardhan himself suggests, the state is effectively dominated by corporate capital. Pranab speaks of the corrupt grip of the corporate oligarchy in Indian political life. Our own, speaking of here, of ISAS, Dr. Narayan of ISAS spoke to me only a few days ago of what he described as the stranglehold of a small number of powerful corporations that actually prevent the liberalization of the economy when it suits them. When, for example, they're able to benefit from the selective allocation by governments of 2G spectrum or of mining concessions. And it's striking that a recent analysis of the basis of the wealth of India's $46 billionaires shows that income from rents exceeds that from profits in technology-intensive productive industry and services. The powerful corporations benefit, too, from some of the lowest rates of corporate taxation amongst major economies, which sit, of course, alongside their demands for control of the fiscal deficit by the cutting back of programs that might deliver on the promise of economic and social rights, and especially the delivery by the state of decent health and educational facilities, in regard to which state expenditure in India is notably low in relation to comparator economies. The poor public provisioning of education and healthcare in India is one of the reasons for doubting how effectively India will be able to capitalize on its demographic dividend. That is, the advantage of having a period in which the numbers of the labour force will be relatively high in relation to the numbers of those dependent upon them. The second factor that I think is quite fundamentally important is what I call the failure of the structural transformation of the economy, which to a great extent follows from the class character of the state. By structural transformation, I mean simply the great transformation of the structure of economy and society that's expected to take place through the process of economic development, which sees agriculture and primary production overtaken by industry and services in contributions to GDP, and the shift of labour out of agriculture into manufacturing and services. This, of course, hasn't taken place in India. In 1950 to 51, agriculture accounted for 61% of GDP and for 76% of employment. Now it accounts for only 16% of GDP or thereabouts, but still for more than 50% of employment. Some recent data suggest that the share of employment in agriculture has actually increased slightly in the course of the last decade. Structural transformation has effectively failed. It isn't happening. A large share of the Indian labour force is effectively excluded, I believe, from productive employment. It is a population that is in some sense surplus to the needs of capital accumulation. And the pattern of India's recent tremendous surge of economic growth, far from delivering on the promise of inclusive growth, is rather described as jobless. National Sample Survey data for the period 2005 to 2010 show that usual status employment has increased by just 0.1% per annum. No. Jobs are just not being created. Without the creation of decent jobs that provide for a degree of security for people, there's little prospect of inclusive growth. Even the absolute numbers of those in good jobs in the formal sector declined for a time early in this millennium, and there's been a steady trend of informalization, even of jobs in big formal sector companies, with the expansion of contract labour, which cuts costs and enhances profits, but at the expense of secure livelihoods. Meanwhile, the agricultural economy, though it's now growing again after a decade of stagnation, is still characterized by low levels of productivity. Average yields of rice, for instance, are only about half those of China, and farms of less than 2 hectares in extent, which means at least 3/4 of them do not adequately provide for the livelihood requirements of their households. My third factor is the persistence and deepening of material inequality, which is still substantially legitimated by hierarchical social values. One way of pointing out the deep inequality in Indian society is in the observation that there is a missing middle in India today, in spite of all the hype about India's burgeoning middle class. As none other than Professor T.N. Srinivasan has pointed out, if the middle class is defined as people with an income above $10 a day, but excluding the top 5% of the population, then even urban India has no middle class, because everyone at over $10 per day is in the top 5%. There is in India now a very marked dualism with a dollar economy, in which prices, as for that vitally important commodity beer, in what are called London pubs, in Delhi shopping malls, prices there for those pints of beer are often higher than in the UK or Canada. Meanwhile, there's a rupee economy in which the finest meal you can buy in a Mofussil town, for example, in Tamil Nadu, and it would be a fine meal, can cost no more than $2 or $3. We know that increasing inequality restricts the poverty-reducing effects of economic growth. Beyond this, the inequalities of Indian society undermine citizenship by making most poor working people dependent upon the mediations of local bosses and politicians in their relations with the state, and substantially account for the persistence of what has been described as patronage democracy. Yet inequality, for all that caste, as we explain in the book, is less significant than it was, is still legitimated. Inequality is still legitimated by those hierarchical values, which still force, for instance, many Dalits into the worst possible jobs and positions in society. And competition for privileges and benefits from the state between people from different social groups, most of them defined on the basis of caste, takes precedence over struggles for greater social justice. No wonder there is so little evidence of political mobilization against the yawning inequalities of Indian society. I'm very well aware that I've presented a bleak view of Indian society today, and some of you here may indeed think that it is a very one-sided view of Indian society today. What can be placed on the other side of the scales? As we argue in our chapter on civil society, there's a great deal of optimism these days about the potentials of Indian civil society for bringing about change through movements such as that directed against corruption led by Anna Hazare, or more recently through the mobilizations around the rights of women in the wake of the appalling rape incident in Delhi in December. We think that there's actually a lot of does one say hubris or hubris? I'm never quite sure. We think that there is hubris in much that is written and said about the potentials of civil society, and that middle-class civil society, and civil, we think of as civil society in India, is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily a sphere of middle-class activism. Middle-class civil society is often neither very civil nor very social. But there are also widespread struggles amongst poor working people over their rights as citizens. Struggles, in a sense, for the establishment of a civil society in bastis, joggi-jopris, squatter settlements. I know I'm a little bit of a romantic about it, but I think of something called the Pen Urme Ekam, Women's Rights Association in Madras, in Chennai, which is a movement of poor women from slums, many of them who've been subjected to domestic violence, working in construction sites as domestic labour. They're struggling for women's rights, which they tie together, quite rightly, with the struggle for the right to somewhere to live and the right to a livelihood. And of course, those three sets of rights do go together. These are people who are struggling actually to establish something like civil society in the context of the slum. It's a very long shot, talking about the long term, but I believe that there is reason for hope over the long term through the diffusion of these values of democratic citizenship through Indian society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Harris. May I now invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, to join Professor Harris on stage.
You set the stage.
No, you will set the stage.
Congratulations.
We shall now call upon Ambassador Pillai to launch the book India Today, Economy, Politics and Society.
Thank you. That's it. Wow.
May I now invite Professor Tan Tai Yong for a group photo, please?
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. You so make it good.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai, Professor Khan, and Professor Harris.